Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of the Prove Me Wrong podcast. I'm your host, Pete Lieb, and as always, I'm glad you have joined me again tonight. We have a great show again. My guest tonight is Dr. Katherine Ramsland, and we are going to talk about her work in forensic psychology. We live in we give a lot of free publicity and attention to the lowest life forms within our society, the outcasts, the murderers, the serial killers, politicians, especially in a medium like this one, the podcast. There are countless show formats dedicated solely to true crime and serial murder, and they are incredibly popular, at least in part, I think, because the outlier to social norms can almost always capture the attention of the masses. Their actions are so foreign to us that it's something we want to know more. And I'm no different. I've had probably half a dozen episodes of the podcast dedicated exclusively to these topics. If you are interested, you can take a look back in the catalog and find interviews on Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, and more. Feel free to go ahead and browse. Tonight, though, we're going to flip the coin and talk about one thing these people all have in common besides murder, and that's the fact that eventually they were all caught. How were they caught, and what were some of the techniques used by investigators to hunt and capture the most dangerous among us? Dr. Ramsland is here to help us answer those questions. Dr. Ramsland teaches forensic psychology at DeSales University, where she is the assistant provost. She has appeared on more than 200 crime documentaries and magazine shows, is an executive producer of Murder House Flip, and has consulted for CSI, Bones, and The Alienist. She's also the author of more than 1,000 articles and 68 books, including How to Catch a Killer. And if you are watching the YouTube or Rumble video cast right now, I did put the cover of the book, How to Catch a Killer, Hunting and Capturing the World's Most Notorious Serial Killers. I put it on screen so you can see it there. If you aren't watching the Rumble or YouTube account, you can certainly find us online and watch the interview versus just listening. She also is the author of The Psychology of Death Investigations and The Mind of a Murderer. She spent 5 years working with Dennis Rader on his autobiography, Confession of a Serial Killer, The Untold Story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer. Dr. Ramsland currently pens the shadowboxing blog at Psychology Today and teaches seminars on extreme offenders to death investigators and homicide detectives. You can find more of Katherine's books on Amazon.com. And let me go ahead and welcome Katherine to the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
We have never had the opportunity to speak before. So if you don't mind, could you start me off with just a little bit more of your history about how you got involved in forensic psychology?
Well, first, I was a philosophy professor. And I did that for a while and decided to quit and do something completely different. And just sort of by serendipity, I discovered a program at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in forensic psychology. It was a master's program. And I was already writing for Court TV's Crime Library, their website. So the two things seemed to go together, and that completely changed my life. Just making that one move and getting that degree put me right into the field of forensic psychology. I'm a consultant, I do trainings, I do teaching, and really never guessed that's what I would end up doing. And in particular, did not aspire to become an expert on extreme offenders like serial killers, but it happened.
So your most recent book is titled, it might be your most recent, you might have something more, you're very prolific, but the most recent one that I know of is called How to Catch a Killer, Hunting and Capturing the World's Most Notorious Serial Killers. Can you describe a little bit of the research that went into a process like that book?
Yeah, that was interesting. It was an editor's idea. They wanted actually, I think they wanted 10 or 12 cases, but I came back with 85 cases of interesting ways serial killers have been caught, and we whittled it down to 30 in 5 categories. And that was based largely on work I had already done on 300, how they were caught cases, to look at some of the factors and percentages of, and especially to get rid of some of the myths about the catching of serial killers or their attitudes about it. So that it kind of, the 30 came out of the 300. So it was really only a tenth of the cases I had looked at. But still, they wanted the whole case of, what happened, what was the capture, who was the killer. And so each of the cases has all of that.
And so the book then is organized by the investigation techniques that resulted in the capture of some of these offenders. Can you spend just a moment and talk about those 5 categories?
Yeah, the first and I think most exciting one is forensic innovation, because we have a number of innovations in the forensic sciences that were the result of cases of serial murder. And so it's interesting to watch how those things go hand in hand. The next one is just really solid police procedure. So between the two of those, that's the majority of these cases, because really solid detective work, made all the difference in some of these. And then witness reports was another one where somebody saw something and they were able to, with some small clue, break the case. And then I have one category of the mistakes that the killers make, which I find interesting because, often they think they're so careful and leave nothing to chance. I mean, that was Dennis Rader, the BTK killer's mantra, leave nothing to chance, and that he made a stupid error that got him caught. And then the last one is the smallest category of killers who have turned themselves in. And that really is a small percentage, but there are a few who have.
Well, to go back to, I took a look at the table of contents and some of the different stories in each one of those categories. And one that hit me with the forensic innovation, because I just watched something on it recently, and it was incredibly interesting to me, was the Golden State Killer. And the fact that they used some type of DNA genealogy to locate this man. Can you go into exactly, I don't know that I understood exactly what they did and how they figured out that he was the guy 35 years later. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's probably one of the most recent and substantive and landscape changing innovations, really, of forensic history. Joseph D'Angelo is the guy. And essentially, he was responsible that we know of. I mean, he's since basically confessed by saying, whatever you think I did, without really giving any details. So, but we think that he was the Visalia ransacker, a guy who was breaking into houses and, taking items that were meaningful to people. And then he became the East Area rapist. And then he became a killer, a murderer, sometimes of couples. And eventually, those were in different areas of California. Eventually, the 3 came together and he was named the Golden State Killer. But nevertheless, they really had no leads as to who it was. This is in the 70s and 80s. So time goes by. Nobody knows if these cases will ever be broken. But there was a detective, Paul Holes, who was working at it as a cold case, and he's looking over things. And he was aware of these ancestry type databases where people were, give their DNA. And he worked with a genealogist to try to they had DNA from a rape case, and they almost didn't, but the pathologist happened to take an extra sample. So that was a touch and go thing as well. They had the DNA, and so they entered it into the database thinking they'd be able to hook it into all these various people who might be related to this person. And then once they get that array of people, they whittle it down to somebody who was in the right place at the right time and matches some of the witness descriptions and is the right age and etc. So it took some time to do that. And I think they got a couple of good suspects, maybe 3. And then finally he was the guy. So they went to look, he's living in the right place. He had been married. He was a father of he had a couple of daughters, I think. He had worked as a police officer.
Right. So
they go, they watched the house. He went out and opened his car door. I think they got some DNA from his car door handle and some trash, and then were able to say, this is the guy, basically. But it was a very long process. But now genealogical DNA analysis has really has broken open a number of cold cases.
I mean, that absolutely seems like a Pandora's box, right? They broke that open, and now everybody who's out there right now active murdering people should be worried.
Right.
They almost have to go out and start killing their relatives, so those people are no longer around.
I agree. The only thing I would say about that is that we don't have DNA in every case.
True.
Not even the majority of cases. So unless you really have the biological samples, and can identify those as being from the offender, that's not really going to help you very much. But
especially he had DNA that was decades old, right?
Worried. And especially those who have committed, a rape, murder years ago and think they've got away with it. And if those samples have been correctly stored and preserved, those people should be worried, because more and more detectives are putting those samples into these databases. The real problem has become invasion of privacy issues, where people who submitted their DNA are saying, what? I didn't think this is what you were going to be able to use it for. And so now we have some databases saying, essentially, if you're going to submit here, and actually the database they used, the deal was you can submit here for free, but we get to use your DNA, for these purposes. So,
So if you suspect somebody in your family being a serial killer, you probably shouldn't give your DNA. Because most people will be like, oh, I don't care about that. Yep, check. I agree, and they move on because they don't know that Uncle.
Most people, even if they, most people don't suspect, even if it's right in front of them.
Right, exactly.
Person's serial killer, even if it's their own kid or their own parent, they don't think so. So they usually don't imagine that this is going to lead to somebody's arrest. What
are some of the limitations of the DNA collection? What is the defense team always talks about contamination and it was collected improperly and it was stored improperly.
Yeah.
What are some of the limitations of this technology?
Well, first of all, the genealogical technology, I mean, that in itself requires a certain amount of interpretation. Mm-hmm. All of forensic science has some degree of interpretation. So, and the more you have that, the more subjective elements can come in. The collection of DNA, and especially the more we're getting methods that can work with smaller and smaller samples, like touch DNA, the contamination factor actually rises with that. Mingled DNA, like for example, if you have a murdered sex worker and several men have had sex with her, you have some issues there. Mm-hmm. The way it's collected, the way it's preserved. If your collection instruments aren't clean, sterile, etc., or you put biological samples in a plastic bag, or you put them in in a evidence room where they might get contaminated by some other sample. We've had cases like that. But so there certainly are ways, but the problem for defense attorneys is being able to prove that that's happened. And it's one thing to claim it. It used to be with early in the 90s when DNA was first being used in the courtrooms, that prosecutors would give these horrendous percentages. Mm-hmm. It's like 300 billion to 1 that it's anyone but this person. And, and rightly so, the defense attorneys became savvy about the math and said, what, you don't even know what you're talking about. And they didn't know what they were talking about. So they weren't able to really explain it. And then, that made some trouble for DNA analysis. So that's a very interesting history. A lot of people think it's just a cut and dried tool, but it isn't.
Well, I mean, even if it's, I guess my question is, if they say, well, it's contaminated with what? With other DNA? So, or is it just saying it was in a dirty bag or what have you? But
either it could be either one. It could be in a bag that wasn't fresh. It could be the technicians who are handling it, their mm-hmm. DNA gets involved in it.
But if my DNA is in it, this is my question. If there's only 2 DNAs, one is mine, the technician, and one is yours, the suspected killer, why can't I use that? Why is that?
Because even the instrument used, I mean, there was this great case in Europe of the phantom killer, it was a female who was showing up at these crime scenes, and she was in cars where nobody saw her.
Yeah.
And she was crossing into other countries, and it was just amazing. And it turned out that they weren't using sterile Q-tip things.
So then the thought process
it was somebody at the factory who was wrapping them. It was her DNA.
Okay.
She wasn't a killer, but it was quite the mystery as to how the phantom killer was able to show up at these crime scenes and nobody remembered ever seeing her.
So then if we have some type of bodily fluid, and it could be potentially somehow just a simple mistake planted there not necessarily planted there, but a simple mistake that happened naturally somehow. Okay. All right. I get it. All right. So catching serial killers is harder than catching typical murderers because the motives are different, right? In some cases, there is really no motive other than just a need to do it. How do investigation strategies change between a typical murder investigation, where the husband is the suspect, the wife has died, and a serial offender? What do investigators do differently?
Well, certainly the domestic homicide is far more common than somebody dying from a serial killer. That's actually considered an atypical murder because stranger homicides are not nearly as common as situational homicides. So that's the first thing. And they'll try to eliminate, you work from the inside out, you work from the victim. That's the start for all investigations. Who's the victim? Who does this person know? Who might have a motive? And then once you're able to eliminate people close, you keep moving outside that radius until you realize maybe this was somebody who didn't know her. And then if you have other similar incidents like this, whether that's a rape or a murder, whatever, you start to do behavioral analysis, which is called linkage analysis, where you're looking at very similar behaviors, especially unique behaviors, like what we call a signature, like certain types of bite marks or knots used, or posing the victim, or leaving them in a certain place, or covering them with leaves, or something like that, or always taking the left shoe, whatever it is. You're looking now at behavioral linkage that would indicate this person's in the mix of someone we think might be a serial offender.
So what are the challenges and limitations with current investigation techniques, and what are some aspects of investigations, in your opinion, that can be improved?
That's a huge question.
So, how about just give me one example? How about just one example of something that in your years?
Challenges. One of the main challenges for linkage analysis.
Let me kick what I think is a challenge off, if I don't mind. I think personal bias of investigators can be a challenge, right? And you see some of these where
now you just added 2 nights to our discussion.
Oh well, because you'll see some investigators and they're like, well, that person can't be the killer. I know them from church, and so then they completely disregard that particular person and add 5 more deaths and 7 more months to their investigation because they just can't believe it, or even.
I have a case like that in the book, David Meyerhofer.
Can you talk about that one a little bit?
He's the first case that the FBI profiling unit, the behavioral science unit, actually worked on and succeeded with their profile. But the police in Montana who were working the case of a child abduction absolutely refused to believe it could be him because he was a clean-cut, I think, Vietnam veteran who was helpful. And they even put him under some kind of truth serum, and there's no way it's this guy. And right there in front of them was not just a guy who had abducted and killed a little girl, but had murdered 2 other people before that, had starting in his teenage years. And yet he came across to them as such a nice guy that there was no way that the FBI profilers, it was Howard Teton and Patrick Malani who started the unit. And Malani said, this is your best suspect.
Right.
And not only that, he's going to call on the anniversary. He's going to call the mother of the child on the anniversary of the abduction, which he did. And they kept predicting these behaviors, and he kept coming through. And still the police could not believe it, because this just wasn't the kind of person they were thinking. So bias is a very important aspect. And that's one of the things I do trainings in with police officers. In part, bias comes out of personality structure. Mm-hmm. Like people who are attracted to police work are often also attracted to closure. So we have a measure in psychology, the high need for closure scale, where people make decisions quickly. They don't like to be second guessed. They use gut instinct. They do a lot of shortcut analysis. And that leads to errors. But if you have a low need for closure, you might take your time, mm-hmm. and that has its own problems. So there's strengths and weaknesses with both. Other types of biases would be, racial biases, gender. But people don't, there are investigators who've said there's no female serial killers, or female serial killers are never sexually compelled. I mean, they just make up these ideas. And from where, who knows where, but this is how people get through the little loopholes that are left by assumptions made, and then officers will overlook someone. Mm-hmm. Dennis Rader, one of the reasons I wrote the book with Dennis Rader is I wanted to show some of the errors that police officers had made with him. He almost got caught one night when he was out using a Boy Scout outing as one of his cover stories. And he had his uniform, and yet he had just murdered this woman. And the police were looking because they, I guess, found her car or something. The police were looking, and he encountered a cop in a rest area. And basically, use the Boy Scout thing. No, there are no serial killers who are, volunteer with Boy Scouts. Well, as a matter of fact, yes, there are.
Yeah, sure.
There are a few. We do have some. But the officer, instead of doing what he should have done, which was look in his car, and he would have found things that would implicate Rader, he gave him a pass, because of course a Boy Scout volunteer, of course that's not going to be a serial killer. So the challenge is to educate and make sure these assumptions don't become hurdles, because those assumptions lead to other people getting killed.
And so that also kind of ties in, you had talked about the myths and misconception of serial killers, right? What are some of the more common, you kind of mentioned a couple, right? That women can't be serial killers, that African Americans or people or minorities in general aren't serial killers. They've kind of given serial killers to white males. White males are serial killers.
Another one in the book is Sam Little, who knew exactly how to manipulate police assumptions. He's a Black male who looked for the victims who would be the most under the radar, that the police would not really spend time and resources investigating. Women of little means who might be sex workers or drug addicts or something in areas where the police wouldn't have very many resources and really just wouldn't bother. And so he figured out, these are the victims that I can kill with impunity, as long as I stay on the move and go from big city to big city. They're never going to catch me. And he claims 93. Now, we haven't corroborated 93, but first of all, he's Black. So, there you go. They certainly have Black serial killers. And secondly, he used what he knew was the cleverest way to go under the radar and keep killing.
So, what are some of the other, you talked about Dennis Rader, and you hear the name BTK, but his personality to me never lent to him to be kind of the rock star like Bundy was. Or Manson, someone with a little more pizzazz. What made him interesting to you? Because you worked with him for 5 years and wrote a book on him. What was the kickoff point for that?
I thought he was an atypical serial killer. And so I thought that was really interesting. He didn't have the things in his background, no head injuries, no abuse, nothing that would signal some of the things we think of when we think of, the indicators of serial what leads offenders into violence. He didn't have any of that. He had intact families, both grandparents alive, all-American boyhood with 3 brothers. And so where did it come from?
Yeah.
So for me, it was a challenge to try. And he basically said when we started, I want you to figure out my factor X. What would it be? And it wasn't really that difficult. And yet, even as I spent all this time with him and ended up writing his autobiography, because most of it's from his point of view, there were still people who said, well, he just didn't tell you the whole story, because obviously he would have been abused if he was going to be a serial killer. So even though I'm trying to use him as a model of maybe that's not a correct way to approach this, that we think we have the formula, and that maybe we don't, it was simply, well, he just left stuff out. Because people want their formulas. They want to believe that, the McDonald triad, for example, which has absolutely no research support for it. People love that whole animal abuse, fire setting, bedwetting triad,
right,
which is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. And yet they love the formula of it. So they want it to stay intact. In part, it makes people feel safe. If they can figure it out and lay it all out, then they feel like, okay, I understand. But I think I wanted to use the example of Dennis Rader to show, no, you really don't understand, and you should be very careful about thinking you understand, because that's why people get into cars with serial killers thinking, aha, this guy isn't the serial killer, when they are.
Ultimately, what, if you don't mind saying, what was his rationale outside of the way he grew up?
It's not his rationale. It's the factors that became entwined together, starting with his childhood. And so it's kind of complicated. I mean, I wrote a whole book about it. I don't think I can do it in a nutshell, but,
sure.
But there were several factors, as is true of every single serial killer case. There are factors, both, their physiology, their culture, their upbringing, things that they encounter, things that become part of if they're sexually compelled killers, that become part of their erotic drive. So you're looking at their whole developmental trajectory to see where do these factors come together, to the point where when they get that opportunity, the things that they've fantasized about, now they're going to act on. Because I'm sure that not all people who have these fantasies actually act on them.
Right.
And some might never have done so had the opportunity not presented itself. Like, I think one of the ones I use in my class is Jerome Brudos. And he had these fantasies, he grew up, with these fetishes with
right.
high-heeled stiletto shoes and women's underwear, that he'd go around the neighborhood stealing from people's houses and laundry lines. So he had these fetishes. And then one day when his wife and kids were gone, a young woman came to his door selling encyclopedias. And there's the opportunity. Had that never happened, it is possible he would have never become a serial killer. But once he brought her in and nobody was there to stop it, and he decided, and it wasn't that he wanted to kill her, he wanted her feet. Oh. He wanted her feet to put in the shoes that he could take pictures of, because that was the fetish. Once he had done it and got away with it, he continued to look for women that he could kill and, do whatever he wanted with. So had she not come to his door, the possibility is he wouldn't have gone down that road. The fantasies would have remained the same, but the opportunity hadn't been there. Rader is similar. He lost a job. It frustrated him. He was breaking into houses and feeling very powerful when he was inside someone's house. And so then he just began, out of frustration, stalking this woman that he saw with her young daughter, because he had fantasies about a mother and daughter. And there was the opportunity. And even with him, he went into the backyard of the Otero house and debated with himself whether he was going to do this. And the young boy Joey Otero Jr. opened the door to let the dog out, and it was over. Had the kid never opened the door, it is possible Rader would not have done that.
So do you feel then, with your background in psychology, I know there's always the debate on whether they're born that way or whether the factors that they grew up with all put together into a stew and that's the way it came out and they evolved into that.
It's a stew, and it's different for each one,
Yeah.
even though there are similarities in their motives, and there's a variety of motives for serial murder. It's not always sexual, which is another myth, but it is a stew of the things that come in and out of their lives during different phases of their lives. And when I teach my class on serial killers, it's case by case. I don't teach trend analysis. I look at what made this person do this, what made this person do this.
So I know you were talking about the McDonald triad, is what you called it, right? The McDonald triangle.
Triad.
But are there certain things that you, in your background and through what you have researched, are there certain things that, and not to make it seem Orwellian here, but that we could take that information and it could aid in the future if certain things happen at certain marker points in a young person's life, that we just make note of it. You know what I mean? We make note of those things. And then if something happens later in life, we can come back and say, well, did these markers, were they hit, at least to make that person someone of interest? I don't know, that maybe
we'd all love to know that.
Yeah,
answer.
right?
The problem is, like, I can tell you, Ed Kemper, so he killed 2 cats when he was a kid out of frustration over a variety of things. But Dennis Rader didn't do that at that age, at the same age that Ed Kemper did that. So he did it at an earlier age. He hanged some cats in a barn because his grandmother didn't like cats. So we had 2 serial killers who killed cats, but then we don't have that with other serial killers. Do you see what I mean? And then we do have animal cruelty with kids who don't become serial killers. So
that's true. That's true.
That's probably one of the primary factors. It's really usually a collection of red flags, but you're not going to be able to pinpoint a given age. Usually it's early, so you might have a maternal figure acting inappropriately, letting grown boys sleep in bed with her, or walking around the house, half dressed. That's one of the ones that we see commonly. Animal cruelty is another one we see commonly. Property destruction, another one. So antisocial behavior, callous disregard of other people's feelings, another one. If we see that in a young person, that's a child at risk for becoming an adult psychopath. However, most psychopaths don't become violent. We have that notion, but it's not true. Most do not become violent. So just because they have callous, unemotional qualities and traits doesn't mean they're going to become a serial killer. So there just isn't a formula for being able to go, okay, I see this kid doing this. This is going to be a problem. We can do some intervention if they're, lying, bullying, being destructive of property. But then what are you going to do with the kid who quietly goes along and never acts out and then becomes a serial killer? Because we have them too. Yeah,
it's more, I wasn't definitely trying to think that you can, so like Minority Report, that movie or Minority Report, where you're arresting them before they commit anything. And I definitely wasn't thinking that. It was more just having a database of information in case once that first 1 or 2 things happen, you can say, you know what? Here's our suspect pool. We have 4 people. Well, this guy right here has all these other histories versus the rest of the other 3. I guess you probably have something like that, but I know
we do have stuff like that, but it's not necessarily that they'll become serial killers.
Right.
The chance that they might act out violently in some way would be high if we, if we look at these factors, but we're not at the point where we have, anything like that in terms of what makes a person into a serial killer. I know that it's out there in the media that we do. I remember one show that I think it was Dr. Phil did, where he was telling parents that their child had, 10 of the 15 markers of a serial killer.
How terrible is that for the parent?
Who's taking that child home?
How terrible is that for the parent? I mean, seriously.
Terrible. And also untrue. There isn't any such list. Where did he get that? So millions of people saw this and now think there's a list. And
they're all side-eyeing the children that they have sitting on their own couch. It's like, oh boy, you were pretty slow on potty training there, Timmy. Exactly. You're in trouble.
So I even talk about that in my class. And I start my class saying, what you think you know about serial killers is probably not right, because you're watching Criminal Minds and all these shows that operate off many of the myths. And some of the myths actually did come from early research by FBI profilers on a very small subset of white incarcerated serial killers who were able to articulate their reasons, which is certainly not representative of the whole population of serial killers out there. But they published their results, and those results got into criminology texts, and they became the basis for some of the ideas we have about serial killers. But those ideas are dated and based on an unrepresentative small sample, so not scientific, and yet they had the power. They captured the imagination, and they became part of media presentations, not just in the news, but in fiction, film.
Well, because it almost seems like magic. Right? These guys walk into a room and they see the body positioning, and they see something that it was obviously staged, and suddenly they're giving you, it's a white male, probably 25 to 30. He lives with his mother in the basement. He tries to have jobs, but he tends to not be able to hold him for 2 weeks. It's like magic. It's like this person is suddenly reading it. So I can totally see how people get it and fall in love with those type of things.
Absolutely. I see it too, but it's unfortunate because a lot of students who come into my program want to become profilers for that reason.
Right.
They want to be the magician.
Yeah, the mystique of it. But nothing takes the place of good, hard police procedure, good police work.
Exactly.
So the second part of your book is talking about people that serial killers that were caught just through good police work. Can you give us maybe the favorite or one that you had, or the one that really maybe caused a new innovation in police work, or something that changed the way it was done?
Well, DNA came from a serial murder case. I mean, that's a great one, the Colin Pitchfork case in England, where they had 2 rape murders of young women on these sort of like little footpaths between small villages. And the police chief or detective was reading the newspaper, and he read about this paternity testing that was happening, and was able to identify if a man had fathered this child. And it was the very first use of DNA analysis, and that scientist was just down the road. So he called and said, have you ever thought about applying this to a murder case? And the DNA analysis was born. I mean, it was amazing. They did the first DNA dragnet, where they had the men all over the region give their blood samples. It was the first DNA exoneration, because they had a guy who confessed, and then they said, nope, it's not him. And then it was the first DNA conviction. It was an amazing case and it changed the world immediately.
There's a lot of video evidence now of interrogation techniques that ultimately they get a confession, but will this confession hold up? I don't know. It's, you're holding young boys in a room by themselves for 12 hours, what have you. How damaging, because you just mentioned a false confession, how damaging are false confessions to an investigation? Because you say some of those investigators, they're very rigid. They don't like to be told. They want their snap judgment. They like to be right. They don't want to have to rethink what they're doing. How damaging is that?
Well, there's, the difference between interview and interrogation. The interview is to get information. Interrogation is the presumption that this person is guilty, and the pressure is on for them to bring it home, to be a closer, to get that confession. because sometimes if they have evidence, it might be really weak or ambiguous. They need the confession to shore it up. So they're going to, and they can lie. They're allowed to lie. They're allowed to say they have witnesses. When they don't, they're allowed to put any kind of pressure on, except physical torture, because we've nixed that. And so they do a lot of manipulation. There's something called the Reed technique that many police officers are trained in, and it is a psychologically manipulated technique. So to them, it's not about the worry about getting a false confession, because I think they believe that if they get the confession and the person really isn't the offender, it'll all wash out somehow by the trial. And it doesn't.
Yeah.
There are many people who've been convicted falsely.
And they're in jail for 20 years. Yeah.
25, 28, 30 years. I know it. Their lives are ruined.
Absolutely.
Over these kinds of techniques. And when they use it on children, it's even worse.
They could get they could get a confession 100% of the time
easily
with a child.
And do, yes.
So that's the question I was going to have, is where's the line between the appropriate amount of pressure and what would be considered coercion? But it looks like it just depends on the mindset of the person asking the questions.
Well, to some extent, it's about what the laws allow. And I know that there is right now a movement to prevent police from lying, because they are allowed to lie right now. There is some talk that maybe that's going to change. If that changes on the federal level, that's going to affect, many states, but not all. I mean, states can do what they want to do. They don't have to follow federal guidelines necessarily. But if police were not allowed to lie, that would take a big weapon away from them. Now, and that being said, it has worked to get the right person too. So, justice has been done as well. It's really difficult to know what to do in these circumstances, because, there are people who do eventually break down and, give their confession, and it turns out all the evidence corroborates what they say, and they're the person. But we do have the problem of false confessions. I
look at there's two recent, they're not serial murders, they're just murderers. Well, potentially. One was that Chris Watts, how quickly when they got him, he is the unluckiest, and no offense meant to anybody. He is the unluckiest man ever, because he had no time. Her friend was so engaged, that the friend of Shalane Watts, she was on it immediately.
Yeah, but when they first went into the house, when police first went in the house, he had the presentation of innocence, of concern, so he did have time. He had time to really, build up something. He just wasn't very good at it.
Well, he hadn't had time to get rid of anything that he could have normally gotten rid of. He probably was still in the process of disposing the bodies when the cops are calling him saying, your wife's friend's here asking where she is. I mean, it was that quick. She was so on top of it.
Yeah, but even without her, the parents already knew that there were some pretty serious issues. He wasn't talking to his wife, had taken the trip, and
right.
She was away, and he wasn't communicating. The parents already knew there were some serious issues. He had all the hallmarks of a domestic homicide here, and especially when he really didn't. I mean, he didn't seem to really show the kind of concern you might expect of a father, not, maybe not about his wife, but his two daughters. So I just think he wasn't very good at it.
And then the other side of that spectrum was a man named Josh Powell, and you might know Josh Powell, who his wife also disappeared. And I only say that because I just talked to a woman who wrote the book about that, and it was so frustrating to me, because that was a situation where if the cops, to me, had put a little more pressure on him and a little more heat on him during the interrogation, he would have folded like a house of cards. Right. Instead, they let him leave and let him go, and he cleaned his car. Yeah, and
maybe they should have. So where do you draw the line? It's not possible to say, because people are so different from one another in these various situations. that the one thing I know from my work in forensics is people will always surprise you. There's always that margin of error. There's always that it's all about probability analysis, not certainty. So should we pressure them more? Should we pressure them less?
Mm-hmm.
There isn't a way to tell what's the right thing to do. Now, we do have laws in place for some things, like you can't physically beat a confession out of somebody.
Right.
But there are things you can do, like holding them for long periods of time until they break down. There was one in Arizona where they had 4 guys in a room. They weren't letting them even use the restroom. They had them urinate in soda cans, and they had them in, I think it was like 20 hours, and they all confessed. As soon as they got out, they're like, we just confessed to get out of the room.
Right.
And they weren't the guys, but because they were held in prison for a couple of months, the 2 juveniles offenders who had been involved in the shooting of, this is the Buddhist monk massacre, the 2 that had been involved in that, one of them persuaded his girlfriend to go shoot a woman in a campground to prove she loved, and the girlfriend was 15, to prove that her love.
Wow.
And they got a false confession out of a handyman who had low intelligence and didn't know what was going on, and he confessed to it. So they have 5 false confessions in one case, and that allowed these kids to be free for a while, long enough for another person to be killed.
Let me just slightly, because I also have another question. I've asked this several times, and depending on who you ask, you get different responses. I want to know about the what I call them the influencers, those who may not necessarily wield the knife, but they coerce other. Charles Manson comes to mind, or people who can coerce other people into committing suicide just through their texts, or like you said, where did they fit in the scale of serial murderers? I mean, is Charles Manson actually a serial murderer, or is he something different?
Well, he might be, but he's not a convicted serial murderer. Yeah. I mean, it's probable that he has killed some people. I mean, he certainly is a suspect in some, but charges were never brought against him. But he's more the puppeteer, the mastermind. And it's pretty clear he brainwashed his followers into this kind of bizarre sense of reality, but also, exploited their need, because mostly they didn't have anywhere to go. He became sort of their savior, their father figure. So he's what we would call a puppeteer, kind of like Jim Jones, and then some of the suicide cults. So there are people with that kind of weirdly charismatic personality. David Koresh, another one, who can get people to do things that they might never do if they had never, ever come under that person's influence.
Are there any other, and I know right now, if I were to ask you right now, in the history of police investigation, if you can't say DNA, what was the number one innovation that really changed the game? I guess I said outside of DNA. Before that, unless maybe you think something else was more impactful to fingerprints. Probably,
I would say that was a big deal, because they were using these body measurements. It was just, I mean, only one person could take those in the same way twice. And, that was something that was going on in Europe and America for a while. And then fingerprints really upended that practice and made a big difference. So I'd say fingerprints would be the second biggest innovation after DNA.
Is there anything else in terms of science that's, well, I mean, I guess we did just say that the 23andMe, I mean, that's a kind of an offshoot of the DNA, but that was a pretty significant scientific discovery.
But also the blood, being able to distinguish animal from human blood, that was a big one. And that's also in the book. That's, I think, the first case in the book was the innovation of, because killers could always say they were butchers or something, or they were out hunting, or that was animal blood, and in this guy's case, furniture polishers, Ludwig Tesno, where he was a furniture maker, and he also, was around animals and whatnot. So he could always even though they saw stains on his clothing, it was very easy to brush that off until somebody came up with a test that was able to show the difference between human and animal blood stains. And that's how they got him for the murders of these children. Another one would be the test for arsenic, a toxicology test.
How many millions of people probably died from poisoning that just went undiscovered?
And still do, because they don't test for everything. Even today, this case isn't in the book, but there was one of a young woman who basically killed her father because she was studying biology or something, and she figured out she had access to a poison that she learned that the normal toxicology tests and forensic testing, they don't cover it. So she could use it, and she succeeded. They decided he had died from a heart attack, but she decided to tell a friend, and that friend couldn't hold the secret.
So that goes under the mistakes and miscalculations.
No, that wasn't not a serial killer. That's not in my book.
Well, I mean, just in general, though, right? I mean,
it's a mistake.
That's her making a mistake.
And we have a number of people who make the mistake of telling somebody and trusting them with their secret. There's a lot of people like that.
Well, you've just had that moment of accomplishment, right? I mean, what good is the accomplishment if no one else knows what you've done?
Correct.
Right? It's like doing anything. If you've done something amazing and no one's there to see it, you've done nothing. So you have to tell them.
And they often have this attitude that I call narcissistic immunity, where they believe they're so special that, they're just never going to get caught. And so they can tell people because they really just feel like immune from arrest. Bundy's a good example of that. And even though they arrested him, you're not going to hold me, or if you do, maybe you can convict me, but you're never going to be able to execute me. That's the attitude.
His goalpost kept shifting, right? His goalpost kept shifting.
All the way to the chair, he was like, "What?
Well, you might get me in the chair, but the the sodium pentothal, whatever that is, that's not going to work, or the electric's not going to work." He just kept moving the goalpost
because they feel like they're destined, they're special, they're untouchable, and so those who have that attitude would probably tell someone because they do want some notice of their ability to actually commit murder, and they often choose the wrong person to tell.
Do you think that with the proliferation of CCTV, the improvement of the DNA analysis, all the digital society that we live in now, national news, do you think that we have gotten to a point, and I know that there are people that are still active, but the Bundys are not around anymore. They can't operate without being caught like they could have done when all you had back then was just local Oregon news or local Colorado news or Wyoming news or wherever he was at, where he was operating at the time. Could he have continued to be successful in this day and age?
Not in the way he was operating, but look at Sam Little. I mean, really, he figured it out. He figured out how to take victims who would not really elicit much in the way of investigative resources. Bundy went after college girls.
The pretty white women. Yeah.
That's going to be the biggest effort, that can be launched. So someone like him is not going to last long, but Sam Little was pretty clever. And there was a guy in England, he did get caught, but the crossbow cannibal I'm talking about, he actually made, I think he's working on his dissertation or something, which was about where in the city of Manchester, I believe, were the CCTV cameras and where weren't they? And so after he did all the research, he figured out where he could go get victims where nobody would be able to record him, until he stupidly forgot that he had one in his apartment.
Yeah, just especially in Europe, and the proliferation of cameras there, you can still get away with it a little bit here in America, in the West, where we're just, there's not quite the same coverage, but we're getting there. I mean,
look at the Bundy and Port case, and that's in the book too, the grinder killer.
Uh-huh.
I can't even believe they didn't investigate this, but he left 2 bodies in the same cemetery, in the same place, sitting in the same way. And he put a suicide note in the hand of one, taking, saying, I accidentally killed the guy before me, and I was so distraught that I killed myself. And for the police, 2 cases closed. They didn't even follow through on it. And then a 3rd body on the other side of the wall. And those 3 were within half a mile of where a body had been found earlier, sitting in the doorway of the very building where Stephen Port lived. How in the world did he get away with that? There was 1 CCTV image, and it wasn't even the police who figured it out. It was the sisters of the 4th victim who went to the police and said, you need to follow through on this. There's no way our brother went into that cemetery and took drugs with that guy. You have to find out who he is. And if they hadn't put the pressure on, he would have gotten away with it.
Wow.
So even though you have the images, doesn't mean somebody's going to get caught.
Well, yeah.
You have to have good police work.
And for some reason, you can get a better shot of the surface of the moon than you can get of somebody walking into a bank, the CCTV in a bank, the CCTV
on Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. You can get a shot of Mars, the Mars rover. It's this beautiful 4K definition, but the guy robbing the bank looks like he's from the old Pong game.
Well, because of the money it takes to keep fresh tapes, and because most hours count for nothing, and who's going to go through all that? So again, it's that idea of it's not going to happen here, or nothing ever happens here. And so this the expense. Who's got the money? What jurisdiction is what voters are going to say, yeah, spend a lot more money on having really good tapes for a bank where nothing ever happens.
So we're coming right up on the hour here, and I really appreciate you spending your time with me. If you wouldn't mind, when you're looking at that book, was there one story, a case in your book that you just felt that kind of give you the biggest revelation, one that you just maybe not necessarily enjoyed, but one that you found the most interesting?
I've been studying serial killers for like 25 years or more. None really stand up, except the Hanging Pro stood out to me.
Okay.
The Hanging Pro was a Japanese guy, Shiraisho, who would go on these very popular suicide websites, and where young women were looking for someone to either help them commit suicide or get into a suicide pact with them so they wouldn't be alone. And he always offered to do that, and he'd bring them to his apartment and murder them, but he didn't know what to do with the bodies, so he just sort of chopped them up and put them in cat litter in ice boxes around his house until finally he just had too many. And he also made the mistake of one guy came looking for a friend that he knew had gone there, and I believe he also was killed, but there were other people who knew about her going there. Uh-huh. But I thought that was interesting. It was very different. But weirdly enough, he was the second guy to do that, to use the suicide websites to get victims. He was the second guy, and he knew about the first guy. So I think those stood out to me because they're very unusual.
Or when you find individuals like those guys who put ads in the paper that they want to eat somebody, and somebody responds.
Yep. Luis, somebody responded and also agreed to do it and signed the paper. Yeah.
I mean, that's
about sexual fantasies, and sexual fantasies is an entirely unusual realm. I mean, it really can be very bizarre. And another one I thought was very unusual is a female Italian woman who was trying to use supernatural means to make sure her son survived being in Mussolini's army. So she murdered and dismembered 3 of her friends, cooked their fat made soaps and candles, and then baked their blood and made tea cakes. Leonarda Cianciulli. I thought she was unusual.
Yeah. Oh, well, you see that, or at least you see that on television. I don't know that I've ever heard about somebody who actually did that, or who were feeding the police officers parts of the body.
She gave them tea cakes. She did. And she had mixed chocolate in just so to mask the flavor.
Yeah.
She did that.
And gave them, and made soap out of their body.
Yep.
Oh, well, thank you so much once again, Katherine. I think I had pages and pages of questions here, and I think I over-prepared. I had too many questions and not enough time.
You had great questions. It was fun.
Well, thank you. Maybe we can get together and I can ask you these 2 pages of questions that I didn't get to. But once again, the book is How to Catch a Killer: Hunting and Capturing the World's Most Notorious Serial Killers. Before we go, would you like to take another moment? I don't know if you have something else in the works, something else that's going on that you're want to promote while you have some time.
I do have other things in the works, but they haven't been published. I'm writing a series about a forensic psychologist, and it's different than what's typically out there for forensic psychology. So, but I'm not able to do anything with that at this time. And I wrote with an former FBI profiler book on spree killers, where we categorized spree killers from around the world and offered police ways to anticipate where they might be going in order to catch them.
What's the difference between a spree killer and a serial killer?
A spree killer is more like a mass murderer, but strung out across at least 2 locations and usually over a longer period of time than a mass murderer, but often motivated for similar things. So we would say a spree killer, their string of murders is precipitated by the same event. So it's like chained together in a way psychologically. Whereas a serial killer tends to have more of a psychological cooling off period, then they troll again, then they go. So the spree killer is like a mass murder event, but strung out more.
So so the initial murder hasn't given them the fulfillment that they were looking for, where they could kick back for a month and kind of bask in that glow of their accomplishment before they have to do it again.
That's not typically what a mass murderer is doing. They're usually killing because of anger. They want to punish people. They want to make a statement. They want to become famous. They want to go back to the workplace and warn people, whatever. So a spree killer isn't doing this for like sexual gratification. It's usually a reactive kind of thing. Okay. And now once they start, they keep going. We had one in Canada during the pandemic that was related to the paranoia of what was going on with the COVID restrictions and what the banks were doing. And he just one day got crazy, started beating up his wife, but she escaped. And so he then went around the neighborhood killing people. He had a police, he posed as a police officer. He was kind of a Mounties freak, but he couldn't get into the Mounties. But he had these cars decked out to look like police cruisers. And so he killed people in his neighborhood, burned down some houses, then took off. And that's a spree killer. That's different from the kind of point of view of a serial killer.
A lot of, and maybe I'm off base here, but a lot of these serial killers tend to have a fascination with law enforcement or police. So they wanted to be a policeman and they're frustrated. They weren't able to make it. They couldn't make it through the psychological evaluations or what have you. You see that a lot, that they'll insert themselves into the investigation, try to, Ed Kemper, right?
Kemper, right? Dennis Rader, definitely.
What do you think? Here's my last question. I wanted to ask about Ed Kemper. When he finally just walked in there, I look at Ed Kemper and I get that he also killed a lot of the co-ed killer. He killed other people than his mother. But when I look at his case, to me, his mother was everything that he had been building up to. And then once he accomplished that, then he's like, well, I've expelled the rage. I'm kind of done with it. What else is there but to turn myself in?
He killed her friend.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. After he killed her and cut off her head and did a few things.
Yeah.
He then called up a friend of hers and murdered her too.
What did he ever mention? What was the rationale for finally just turning himself in?
Well, yeah, he had a rationale, but I think the truth is he just ran out of resources. He took a bunch of no-dos and he drove for 3 days and ended up in Colorado. And then he just didn't have any place to go. And also he kept thinking he was going to hear news about this. And what he said was he did not want his mother's body to rot in the house. He wanted to make sure somebody went back there before she decomposed too much. So that was part of it. But also, I think he just had nowhere to go. He didn't have money. He didn't have a job. This is a guy who never wanted to work or do anything. Whatever jobs he had was sporadic, and he was living on some really low disability payments. So I think he just simply realized, and also, but when he did turn himself in, he talked and talked and talked and talked. He wanted credit. He was upset because he saw that they were looking at other suspects. He wanted credit. He wanted to make sure that those victims got discovered and credited to him. So part of it was that he wanted that kind of notoriety. He wanted to be somebody. He wanted to be a police officer because he wanted to be looked up to. And he wanted to do bad things to bad people and help people in need.
Right.
That, he had this John Wayne fantasy in his head, and that's what he wanted to be, but he was too tall to be a police officer. But
which is odd, right? The irony. He wanted people to look up to him, but he was too tall for them to look up to him.
There's a lot of irony in his life. He wanted his mother dead because he hated her. But, even at that, some people think that he killed her in this kind of fury, but it wasn't. He just decided that he was going to kill her. And he even thought of it as a mercy killing, because he was thinking the police were closing in on him and they were going to figure out that he had murdered the 6 co-eds. And he didn't want his mother to have to go through that. So that was actually a rationale he offered, was he decided to kill her because to spare her from knowing what he had done to these young women. So it wasn't just this sort of burst of anger and hatred at her, which he could have done at any point because he was, pretty angry at her. But it was similar to what he said about when he killed his grandparents when he was 15. First, he killed his grandmother, and then he said 2 things. One was he killed his grandfather because he didn't want his grandfather to suffer from realizing, his wife was dead. But then he also said, I was afraid Grandpa was going to come after me with his pistol and kill me. So I did it in self-defense. So, Ed, which is it? One or the other. But he did that constantly, telling different stories about his motivations.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, I know, like I said, I mentioned a couple 5 minutes ago that was my last question, but once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And, hopefully we can talk to you again and I can ask you the rest of my questions. And thanks. Have a great evening. And once again, you can find your books on Amazon.com, right?
Yep. All
right. So thank you. And we'll talk to you again. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
So once again, that is Katherine Ramsland. We were talking about how to catch a killer, and just a fountain of knowledge there. Man, I literally could have gone on for probably another hour, but I like to try to keep the show in an hour format so that people don't lose focus. But maybe we can get her back on again eventually as well. But it is interesting to talk about how different people got caught, some of the ways that whether it be some type of, the Golden State Killer, that's amazing to me. That the guy, he had gotten away with it. It was over. He had gotten away with it. It had been 20 years, 30 years, however long it was since he had committed his last murder. And they found him anyway. They linked him based on a distant relative of his who took a genealogy test. And they worked it back to him and positively identified him as being the killer 30 years later. That's amazing. And then you have just, sometimes it's good police work, but then Katherine was very open about the fact that we have a lot of issues with false admissions, coerced admissions of guilt, just people maybe who potentially just have mental illness and are trying to gain some kind of fame by claiming that they were guilty. So who can tell what exactly the motivation is or how that confession came around? But it is something that I think it is an opportunity for improvement in the way that we get some of these confessions, because you do have certain times when the appropriate amount of pressure is applied and you get a good confession. Then you have times when too much is applied and you get a coerced confession. Then you have times like Josh Powell where not enough was given and you let the man go and he destroys evidence and he moves out of the state and he takes his children with him and ultimately he blows himself up in a house with his 2 kids. That's not the outcome that you want. But, as always, serial killers, they are a fascination. They're a fascination of mine, a fascination of millions of people. Just what is going on upstairs, what is broken in there that causes you to do what you do. Katherine does feel like they're all made. There's all some type of stew that goes into that. All the factors of their early childhood and their lives are thrown in there, and this is what comes out. And you want to be able to predict it, but unfortunately, I think you probably can't. Maybe all you can do is after these murders begin, you have some type of database or you have some type of information that can help you narrow down and pinpoint down into the appropriate suspect later. But even then, you have to fight through investigator bias. It can't be this person, they're a woman. Can't be this person, they're a minority. Can't be that guy, he's a Boy Scout troop leader. Bias kills investigations. When you have it in your mind that this person can't possibly be a murderer because he goes to church with you on Sunday, that's a problem. So, interesting conversation. I did have a lot more questions. Maybe I can get her back and talk to her again. But what are your thoughts? You can contact us through our Gmail account. It's provemewrongcast@gmail.com. You drop us a line. Let us know what your thoughts on the conversation tonight. You can also comment on our YouTube or Rumble page. Give us your comments on the discussion or any thoughts that you had or any questions that you might have for Katherine or different investigation techniques for how serial killers are tracked and eventually caught. You can also find us on Facebook. We are Prove Me Wrong is just the Facebook name of the Facebook page. And if you are just looking for other opportunities for how to listen to the podcast, you can find us on really any podcast platform that you may use. We're on Spotify, Stitcher, Tunein Radio, SoundCloud, iTunes, any podcast platform that you use, you can find the Prove Me Wrong podcast. Like and subscribe to the show, and you'll be notified when a brand new episode is released. We typically release them once a week. So sign up for notifications and like the page, and you will be notified when a brand new episode is released. We are also on YouTube and Rumble. I mentioned it earlier. YouTube.com, Prove Me Wrong, and Rumble.com/Prove Me Wrong. You can look us up on our video formats as well, and you can actually watch the conversation that I've had with Katherine. Also, if you like the work that we do and you want to support the Prove Me Wrong podcast, we do have a Patreon account. It is patreon.com/PMW Podcast. You can like and subscribe to that as well. And if you are a patron of the show, there are additional episodes that are not currently published are available for patrons on the site. So if you would like to help us out and donate and become a patron to the Prove Me Wrong podcast, patreon.com/PMW Podcast. Look us up, and we would appreciate it. Before we go tonight, I did want to say that this episode of the Prove Me Wrong podcast is brought to you by ZendoZones citronella burners from JT Eaton. I have my own ZendoZone right there. That's Surf and Stan. They're shaped like fearless bug repellent tiki gods. You see, this is a tiki god. So let Surf and Stan, Hawaiian Howie, and Luau Lily bring the islands to your backyard with ZendoZone citronella burners. They use natural 3% citronella candles and incense cones. They're perfect for patios, decks, backyards, campsites, poolside, and more. You can enjoy the outdoors again. They are available on Amazon.com and at select Ace Hardware stores. So go ahead and find yours today. So once again, for my guest, Katherine Ramsland, the name of the book is How to Catch a Killer. This is Pete Lieb, the Prove Me Wrong Podcast, and we will see you again soon.